Iran is not threatening to retaliate. Iran is retaliating, right now, across 6 sovereign nations that did not attack it, did not declare war on it, and in most cases were actively trying to prevent this from happening. The UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, all 6 named, all 6 now absorbing Iranian missiles and drones. And the target list is not theoretical. It is operational, it is active, and the volume of ordnance being directed at countries that are not parties to this war tells you something that no official statement from any government has been willing to say out loud. Iran has decided that the entire Arabian Peninsula is the battlefield. That is not retaliation. That is regional warfare. Before we get into this, thank you for being here. I genuinely appreciate every one of you watching. Make sure you are subscribed and hit the like button so more people can follow what is happening. Now let's get into it. To understand why Iran named these 6 countries and what it intends to accomplish by striking them, you need to understand the sequence that brought us here, because this did not begin on February 28th. The Iranian regime entered 2026 at arguably its weakest point in years. Massive protests swept the country in January, driven by a collapsing economy and crumbling infrastructure. The regime responded by killing tens of thousands of its own citizens, the largest crackdown since the revolution itself. Iran's regional allies had already been significantly weakened by Israeli military operations stretching back to 2023. And joint U.S.-Israeli strikes during the 12-day war in June 2025 had already degraded Iran's defenses and nuclear program. The regime was cornered domestically, diminished militarily, and increasingly isolated diplomatically. And then came the negotiations. In mid-February, the U.S. and Iran began indirect nuclear talks through Oman. By February 27th, Oman's foreign minister announced what he described as a breakthrough. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium and to accept full IAEA verification. Peace, by the mediator's own assessment, was within reach. Talks were scheduled to resume on March 2nd. They never resumed. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack on Iran during the negotiations. The opening salvo killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in a targeted strike on his compound. His daughter, son-in-law, grandchild, and daughter-in-law were also killed. The strikes that followed targeted military bases, government buildings, the state broadcaster's headquarters, the parliament, and eventually nuclear facilities, including Natanz. That gap between what diplomacy promised and what military action delivered is the engine driving everything that has happened since. The Omani foreign minister who brokered those talks said he was dismayed that active and serious negotiations had been undermined. That is not the language of a neutral observer. That is the language of someone who understands that the diplomatic framework he constructed was destroyed while it was still functioning. Now, here's where the 6-country target list becomes structurally inevitable. Iran stated explicitly that any country allowing its territory to be used for attacks against Iran would be considered a legitimate target. That declaration converted every U.S. military installation in the Middle East from a bilateral arrangement between Washington and a host nation into a targeting coordinate for Iranian missiles. The UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Jordan all host U.S. military assets. Air bases, naval facilities, command centers, logistics hubs. The moment Iran declared those assets legitimate targets, the host nations became theaters of war whether they consented to it or not. And the numbers tell you this is not symbolic. This is sustained industrial-scale bombardment. As of late March 2026, Iran had launched 357 ballistic missiles, over 1,800 drone attacks, and 15 cruise missiles at the UAE alone. Qatar absorbed 203 missiles and 87 drones, plus an attack involving 2 fighter jets. Saudi Arabia was hit by at least 38 missiles and 435 drones. Jordan was targeted with 204 combined missiles and drones. Bahrain received 132 missiles and 234 drones. Even Oman, the country that mediated the peace talks, was struck by 16 drones. Those are not warning shots. Those are consumption rates. And when you map the targeting patterns, you see something that should concern every analyst watching this conflict. Iran is not just hitting military installations. Iranian ordnance has struck residential areas, economic facilities, international airports, hotels, and energy installations. The targeting has expanded beyond any plausible definition of striking U.S. assets, and into what can only be described as economic warfare against the Gulf states themselves. Consider what happened in the UAE. Debris from intercepted missiles caused damage in Dubai around Palm Jumeirah and near the Burj Al Arab. Dubai airport was hit by debris on March 1st. A drone struck near the Fairmont Hotel on Palm Jumeirah, causing an explosion and fire. Private jet evacuation costs reached $250,000. Expats fled so quickly they abandoned their pets. tied to poles, left in the desert, or euthanized. That is not collateral damage. That is the systematic destruction of the confidence framework that made Dubai possible as a global city. In Qatar, the damage went beyond physical. Qatar Energy, which produces approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply, halted all LNG production after Iranian drone strikes on its facilities. That single operational decision removed a fifth of global LNG capacity from the market overnight. Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, the complex housing the world's largest LNG export plant, suffered what officials described as extensive damage. In Kuwait, Iran launched attacks toward the airport, electrical infrastructure, and residential buildings. A fire at the Subia power station's fuel tank was caused by drone debris. A child died from injuries sustained when drone debris fell on a residential area. In Bahrain, Iranian missiles targeted the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet multiple times. 32 civilians were injured in a drone attack in the Strait district, and the Babco refinery was damaged. In Saudi Arabia, a strike on a compound in Al-Kharj killed 2 people and injured 12. Missile and drone attacks targeted military sites, oil facilities, and sensitive areas across the kingdom. That is 6 countries. None of them attacked Iran. None of them declared war. None of them requested the United States to initiate this conflict. Most had actively sought to de-escalate the situation and encourage diplomatic solutions. And now their airports are closed, their energy infrastructure is burning, their citizens are sheltering, and their economies are contracting in real time. The question is not whether Iran has the right to strike these countries. The question is what strategic logic governs the targeting. Iran's calculus is arithmetic, and the arithmetic is straightforward. By March 5th, Iran had already fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles, and nearly 2,000 drones since the war began. Roughly 40% of launches were aimed at Israel. 60% were directed at U.S. targets across the region. That ratio tells you where Iran believes the center of gravity lies. Israel is a target. The Gulf states are the battlefield, and that battlefield now extends to the global economy through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran effectively closed the strait, a 21-mile-wide waterway that carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. Tanker traffic dropped by 70% almost immediately, with over 150 ships anchoring outside the strait. Soon afterward, traffic dropped to approximately zero. Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years, reaching $126 at peak. The International Energy Agency called it the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a side effect. That is a weapon. Iran has converted the global energy supply chain into a pressure instrument, and every country that depends on Gulf oil and gas, which is most of them, is now absorbing the economic consequences of a war they had no role in starting. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all contracts. Oil production across Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE collectively dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day by mid-March. In Europe, gas benchmarks nearly doubled. The European Central Bank postponed planned rate cuts and raised inflation forecasts. Japan, which imports roughly 70% of its oil through the strait, began releasing strategic reserves. The Gulf states themselves now face something unprecedented. Over 80% of their caloric intake transits through the Strait of Hormuz. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted. These are countries whose entire economic and social model was built on the assumption that the strait would remain open, that the energy trade would flow, and that proximity to American military power would deter exactly this kind of attack. Every one of those assumptions has now been tested to failure, and here's the political consequence that compounds everything. The Gulf states initially urged restraint and diplomacy, but after weeks of sustained Iranian attacks on their civilian and economic infrastructure, they began urging Washington not to end operations before significantly weakening Iran's military capabilities. That shift, from mediator to participant, from advocate for peace to advocate for continued war, is Iran's strategic failure. By striking 6 countries that were not belligerents, Iran has converted potential sympathizers into adversaries. On March 26th, all 6 Gulf countries plus Jordan issued a joint condemnation of Iran. The promise-reality gap here is not just between what diplomacy offered and what war delivered. It is between what Iran claimed it was doing, targeting American military assets, and what it actually struck. Airports, hotels, refineries, power stations, residential neighborhoods, and a child in Kuwait. The UAE's foreign ministry called the attacks terrorist attacks. That language does not get walked back. As of late March, intelligence sources reported that Iran would continue strikes against Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE, while reportedly pulling back from attacking Saudi Arabia and Qatar. A calibration that suggests Iran recognizes it has limits, but only after exceeding them. The damage to Gulf infrastructure, to global energy markets, to shipping lanes, and to the diplomatic relationships Iran spent years carefully building with these exact countries is not reversible by calibration. It is structural, and that brings us to the question that no one in any capital, not Washington, not Tehran, not Riyadh, not Abu Dhabi, Ifritz, has publicly answered. If Iran's stated objective was to punish the United States and Israel for a surprise attack launched during peace negotiations, and the result is that 6 uninvolved countries are now militarily committed against Iran. The Strait is closed, the global economy is contracting, a child is dead in Kuwait, pets are abandoned in Dubai, and the entire Gulf security architecture has been redefined. At what point does the leadership in Tehran acknowledge that the retaliation itself has inflicted more strategic damage on Iran's long-term position than the original attack ever could? Thank you for watching. I would like to hear your answer to that question in the comments. Make sure you are subscribed, like the video, and share it so more people can follow this. I will see you soon.